Black women's urban mobility challenges apartheid. Black women had lived in towns and cities long before apartheid, attracted to urban life both by a desire to escape rural familial tensions and by economic necessity. African access to land had been severely restricted since the Natives Land Act of 1913, with clearly declining land productivity by the 1920s, and the rural reserves grew more stressed with apartheid's forced relocation. Women's options for formal urban employment were limited, with most consigned to domestic service. But women had long been developing a vibrant informal urban sector. They brewed and sold beer and other foods to male migrant workers and operated bars called shebeens, amongst other jobs. By the early 1950s, more than a fifth of African women were urban, and many of these women lived in ethnically mixed neighborhoods. While black women's urbanity concerned officials before apartheid, especially when they worked as prostitutes, officials had never been sure what to do about it. African men in major cities had been required to carry individual passes before apartheid, although laws varied by municipality. But officials had rarely imposed individual passes on women. This was, first, because attempts to do so had engendered resistance, as seen in Bloemfontein in 1913, when hundreds marched against pass laws for black women. At a deeper level, officials expected African women to be governed through their men. When laws referred to natives, they usually meant African men. African women were seldom singled out as political subjects, as they were legal minors under customary law, and thus not proper persons in their own right. The language of 1952 pass law legislation was characteristically vague, first stating that pass laws would apply to every native aged 16 or older, but then shifting to masculine pronouns. Officials prevaricated about when and how pass laws would be extended to African women under the terms of the 1952 legislation, facing public outrage about this intrusion into family life. Then, in 1955, officials announced that individual passes would soon be issued to African women. Women's organized resistance, discussed in the next section, delayed full implementation of this requirement until 1963. Yet women kept moving to cities, whether or not they could claim Section 10 rights or passes testifying to their legal right to be there temporarily. Many lived covertly in informal settlements of shacks or with men in migrant labor hospitals. They faced frequent prosecution for breaking the law and forced deportations to Bandustans. This risk was especially pronounced for Africans in Cape Town, where most working-class jobs were reserved for colored men and where African women had access to few formal jobs outside of low-paid domestic service. But women often turned right around after their deportations to catch the next bus into town, despite feeling like a hare being chased around, hunted. The everyday presence of black families in urban spaces legally defined as white, where black people were only supposed to appear as necessary to meet white labor needs, powerfully challenged core tenets of apartheid. Ultimately, the expense of combating this unstoppable movement of black families to cities forced apartheid officials to end pass laws in 1986. Africans' women migration then accelerated, with continually rises of female-headed households. Black women's defiant mobility thus worked to renegotiate relationships between genders and generations. Amidst this insistent mobility, growing numbers of women in rural reserves were also not fulfilling the roles that officials envisioned. Resistance to the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951 surged quickly, and women played key roles in rejecting the co-option of chiefly authority and implementation of new agricultural policies. With organized protests in places including the Western Transvaal area of Zeerust in 1957 and the Natal countryside in 1959. The latter protests significantly linked urban and rural issues, as women protested both apartheid removals from the interracial urban community of Cato Manor in Durban and intrusive settlement schemes and taxes, the rural reserves surrounding the city. While the ANC did not initiate these protests, its members were involved in them, and ANC membership increased in their aftermath. Rural women's engagement in religious groups such as Mothers' Prayer Unions, Manyano, which also boasted linked urban branches, provided another font for growing anti-apartheid organization. Cyclical migration, driven by forced removals and by women's decisions to return to rural areas after periods of work in cities, kept urban and rural communities linked. Anti-apartheid linkages between towns and countryside would only accelerate as apartheid officials increasingly banned political leaders to remote districts to try to eliminate them as national leaders amidst surging protests from the 1950s. This strategy could backfire as banned leaders connected with people in these rural districts whom they would not otherwise have met. Women often made these connections by engaging in social welfare work, which seemed less objectionable to officials than overt political organizing. Most famously, during their bannings in the 1970s and 1980s, Black Consciousness Movement activist Mampela Rampele and the ANC activist Winnie Mandela organized health clinics, which became centers for spreading anti-apartheid ideas. The politicizing role of healthcare speaks to women's broader socio-cultural style of anti-apartheid organization. Women's collective organization challenges apartheid. The pattern of male leadership of political movements and women's influence at movements' grassroots persisted through the apartheid years, with women tending to play influential roles in socio-cultural wings of the anti-apartheid movement. In the 1950s, women first organized against apartheid as mothers, uniting across lines of race and class. Both the achievements and limits of their foundational strategies set a pattern, which would emerge vividly in the 1960s and 1970s. The pattern was that women would organize most effectively by using discourses of family. But when women raised sensitive issues pertaining to their own family lives that did not fit within activist campaigns, men often dismissed these issues as ancillary to immediate political struggles. Many women would come to share male leaders' emphasis on family as a strategic political discourse more than an immediate site of political struggle. This was so especially in the 1960s and 70s, when major liberation movements were forced into exile and key male and female leaders banned, heightening the stakes of eliminating anything deemed a distraction. Finally, in the 1980s and during the transition to democracy in the 1990s, women increasingly challenged activists' sublimation of personal issues in political arenas, using indigenous and international forms of feminist critique. The Congress Alliance and Federation of South African Women in the 1950s, the foundational period. In the 1950s, opposition to apartheid centered in the Congress Alliance, a front of anti-apartheid movements in which the ANC played a predominant role in partnership with the South African Indian Congress, the Colored People's Congress, and the white leftist Congress of Democrats. The Congress Alliance was a multiracial organization because it comprised those racially distinct affiliate organizations. In the mid-1950s, two major non-racial member organizations, comprising both black and white members, joined the Congress Alliance: the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU, and the Federation of South African Women, FETSO. Women played important roles in the SACTU, as unions provided a distinctive forum in which women could unite as workers across racial lines. And female trade unionists played central roles in the 1954 launching of FETSO, listed women from the ANC. FETSO's first president was Ida Mtwana, former president of the ANC Women's League, Her better-known successor as FEDSAW's leader, Lilian Ngoyi, also served as president of the ANC Women's League. Both women worked in the garment industry. Their activism characteristically emphasized issues of work and family. On one hand, the women often spoke of women's commitment to anti-apartheid struggle as necessitating that they move away from domestic responsibilities. For instance, Ndwana declared at FEDSAW's founding meeting, "Gone are the days when the place of women was in the kitchen and looking after children. Today, they are marching side by side with men in the road to freedom, in political meetings and in trade unions." But Ndwana went on to stress that women's public activism was rooted in their responsibilities as mother. "We cannot sit down and fold our arms when attempts are being made to hold our progress and that of our children. If we do not fight now, it will be too late, and our children will curse us for our callousness." Such invocations of familial responsibilities should not be taken narrowly as statements about individual women's lives, but broadly as skillful public discourse. Several key FEDSAW leaders, including Miss Ndwana, were unmarried or childless themselves. Black women drew upon the public leadership they exercised as mothers in their communities to forge ties across racial lines, appealing to white women through appeals to a shared moral economy of motherhood. Discourses of motherhood therefore demonstrated black women's rejection of apartheid ideas of white women as empire builders and black mothers as social problems, and reflected black women's bold political imagination of a shared community of mothers with the responsibility for creating an anti-racist world. Unifying maternal discourses were an achievement because divisions between black and white women ran deep. After all, the major space of interracial encounter was domestic service, where black women tended intimately to the needs of white madams and their children for low pay, often living away from their own children to stay in the backyards of their employers. Moreover, white women have won suffrage in 1930 at the expense of black men's loss of their limited franchise, something that black activists did not forget. Making connections across racial lines, including amongst African, colored, and Indian women who increasingly lived in separate communities, was a great challenge. Despite tensions, FEDSAW succeeded in uniting women as mothers against apartheid policies that divided black families and communities, centrally against past laws and Bantu education. In June 1955, FEDSAW participated in the Congress Alliance's Congress of the People in Kliptown, Johannesburg, where FEDSAW issued a list of what women demand, beginning with claims to rights such as paid maternity leave, childcare, and contraception for all mothers of all races. Famously, FEDSAW then organized multiracial delegations of women to march on the seat of the apartheid government, the Union Buildings in Pretoria. FEDSAW and COD member Helen Joseph was inspired by a liberal white women's organization, Black Sash, which had been haunting apartheid officials by surrounding them with groups of women wearing the eponymous black sashes, signs of mourning against apartheid policies. With her comrades in FEDSAW, Joseph incited more powerful multiracial activism. On October 27, 1955, 2,000 women followed the symbolic quartet of Joseph, ANCWL President Lilian Ngoyi, Colored People's Congress activist Sophie Williams, and the heavily pregnant South African Indian Congress activist Rahima Musa, bearing petitions to leave for cabinet ministers. On August 9, 1956, day now celebrated as Women's Day, 20,000 women marched with FEDSAW on the Union Buildings, coming from as far away as Cape Town and leaving thick stacks of individual petitions protesting the extension of passes to women on the doorsteps of the Prime Minister's office. The women, many with children, sang the ANC's anthem and taunting anti-apartheid songs, then gathered for a half hour of stunning silence, richly documented by journalists and photographers. Such iconic activism delayed implementation of pass laws for women until 1963, but it also led to deepening state repression against FEDSAW activists that made the organization effectively moribund by the early 1960s. FEDSAW members struggled not only with divisions amongst anti-apartheid women, but also with struggles between these women and officials. They also confronted tensions with anti-apartheid men, tensions amplified by the ANC's dominance in the Congress alliance. Men had consistently served as ANC presidents from its 1912 founding, even though women had been full members of the ANC and leaders of the ANCWL since 1943. Significantly, scholar Shireen Hassim has described, the early ANC was a political family and it replicated the hierarchical form of a patriarchal institution. The ANCWL's founding president, Madiho Nxuma, was the wife of the ANC's president, Dr. A.B. Xuma. The National Executive Committee, NEC, was all male prior to Lillian Ngoyi's election to it in late 1956, recognizing her impressive work in FEDSAW. The NEC mediated between the party's membership and the state, while the ANCWL focused on the everyday social and economic needs of its membership. Both oversaw the ANC Youth League, which pushed party elders leftward. Women in both the Youth League and Women's League often chafed against the restrictions of male party leaders, who encouraged women to engage in educational campaigns rather than confronting authorities with further protests after 1956. Men's attitudes reflected both a protective impulse and patriarchal assumptions that women should remain marginal to politics. Above all, Congress alliance men often failed to see women's discussions of family issues that did not fit into the central activist platform as matters of politics. For instance, they responded to FEDSAW women's discussions of family planning with what scholar Cheryl Walker has characterized as jocular dismissal. Anti-apartheid men's dismissal of women's discussions of family planning were profoundly ironic for two reasons. First, intimate issues of family were actually central to issues of apartheid government, which hinged on control of racialized bodies and homes. Second, activist men relied upon women's deft public rhetoric of motherhood to bring more activists into the anti-apartheid movement. They acknowledged anti-pass issues as central to the movement. Yet most activists were no more ready for open discussions about real tensions of sexuality and family than were puritanical apartheid officials. Other matters of oppression loomed too large. Reticence about public discussion of sexuality applied to both male and female activists. Most had been raised in religiously conservative homes and schools, where intimate matters were treated delicately. Were communists who saw in the issues as subordinate to class issues, or were both communists and Christians? Anti-apartheid activists relied on rallying familial discourses, but discomfort talking about family tensions that did not fit within the central anti-apartheid platform would deepen with state repression in the 1960s and 1970s, as the need for activist discipline, already significant in the 1950s, grew.